Hey everyone, and welcome to a special guest interview, and this time I get to meet someone I have been a fan of since I started looking up things about the TCG. You may know him from the Uni-Young team, as he often introduces himself on his videos. We've got, hello again, it's Steve D of the YYT. Steve, how are you, sir?
You memorized the line. Oh, thank you very much.
It's such a classic intro. Like, I love always hearing that, whenever you do one of your deck
I don't know
techs.
if it was just nerves or something. When I started doing my first couple of videos, I just said that, and someone pointed out to me afterwards, do you know you've begun your two videos the same way? And I didn't, and I was mortified the first time, and then I thought, I have to play this off as if it was deliberate all this time, and so I never stopped.
Well, you fooled me. I assumed that was like, oh yeah, that's my intro. That's my little tag. So, no, I loved it. And I've always been a fan of your deck techs, and I've started doing my own, was definitely very inspired by yours. I liked the way you would put all the cards out physically on your playmat and just kind of explained your I always appreciate your thought process when you're talking about your deck techs, because even though I don't always agree with you, trust me, there's sometimes I'm like, man, why does this guy hate Heian so much? Why does he think Minwoo is so bad? But again, you explain your reasoning, so...
Sure, yeah. The structure of Deck Tech Talks, I used to play a lot of Magic, mostly sort of modern, legacy, card pool stuff, and when you're playing with a really big card pool, there will be interactions you've missed, there will be things you didn't realize were the case. So, mostly from following sort of expanded card pool games, I really appreciated other people's videos where they would say, here are the core interactions of the deck, here are the cards you should not mess with the quantities of. And even when a new set comes out, I try and explain videos like that. Here's the cool new stuff. Here's the old stuff you shouldn't change. Here are the flex slots. And the structure just kind of made sense to me when I was watching other people's videos, and I tried to identify the patterns that I identified with.
Yeah, that's great. I find that to be very helpful. Thank you for putting out that content for the community.
No problem at all. It's honestly a lot of fun. I can lose an entire afternoon just recording a few of them and then putting them out over the course of a couple of weeks. If I have a couple of criticisms of myself, it's that I don't do tech slots an awful lot. I tend not to assume a particular metagame until I'm going to a really big event, and I feel bad about diluting 3 of that I know is a good card for the sake of you probably could get away with 2 copies and 1 copy of Hecatoncheer because it beats the loop deck or stuff like that.
Right.
I don't tech out my lists too much. I consider my decks a sort of a core deck, and I am happier rather than sadder if people use them as inspiration and then deviate from them, because I'm sure that with a little bit of tuning, you'll go a bit further. And the other criticism, I suppose, of myself is that I find it difficult to give out a deck list that I don't think is good enough to win a locals or probably top cut a regional or something. I have probably made 50 to 60 times the number of deck lists that have appeared on the channel, but I'm just like, nah, there's something missing. I don't have the time to figure it out, and I don't want to leave, particularly new players, if maybe your first $50 into the game would be going towards one of my decks that isn't good. I would feel bad if I led people down the garden path, so to speak, with a deck that wasn't quite there. So there is a lot more going up on here than there is going on YouTube at the moment, but that's mostly because Doga is a harsh mistress.
It is a harsh mistress. About the tech slots, you mentioned tech slots. I've had a lot of people ask me on my videos after, oh, why didn't you put this in? Or why didn't you put, why'd you only run 1 of these instead of 3? And similar to you is like, it's really more just like a jumping off point inspiration. Like, make whatever you want of it. Especially like my summon slots are usually my most flexible thing. Like, whatever summons you like, put whatever you want in that. I'm just saying this is just what I picked, so...
Well, that's the thing. I think that tech slots or things that are definitely good cards in those elements, you've got to change what those cards are depending on the environment you're taking a deck to. I do not think that there is one deck that can just dominate without changes in any kind of environment. Even something that is fairly linear like Doga, the monster of Opus 14. If I was playing that in a room in which I knew that a third of the room or half of the room was also going to be playing Doga, I would be changing bits of the deck. Sure, not the forwards and not the couple of backups, because the ratios and the logic behind them is basically mathematically complete.
Yeah.
But the summons I was playing, if I knew I was in a really aggressive room, then bigger, splashy, or EX bursts start to make more sense, Or if I knew I was going to be playing against Verstale and Doga a lot, like the light competition this weekend, Top Cut seems very aggressive. Yeah. Chocobos as well, I think was the top deck after Swiss. So in really aggressive rooms, you've got to tailor your deck and not take something verbatim as a 50-card list that is immutable.
Sure, absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned EX Burst. I kind of want to get your thoughts on that because I'll never forget there was this thread on Reddit, and this was maybe a year or two ago. It's been a while, and someone said, "What's your least favorite part of the game?" And I remember someone said, "Well, it's EX Burst. I hate it because it's basically just a luck factor. You know, you hit a burst, it's Remora, they draw a card, you lose a 4, whatever." And at the time, I really defended them because what I liked about EX Burst is that, you know, when you take a point of damage, you're 1 point closer to losing. That's one less card you have in your deck. And if it's a key card, you can't get that back anymore. Yeah, Larsa kind of messed with that, but at the time you couldn't. So I liked that there was this kind of a chance that maybe you would actually get something out of it. And in particular, it makes certain games exciting, right? If there was no such thing as EX Burst, there's some matches that you don't even need to play out because it's, oh, I have 3 attackers, you have 1 blocker, I'm going to win. Whereas, well, there's always that chance that burst could come in. However, lately, I won't deny, especially playing against something like Doga that has so many bursts where it's just like, I feel like I'll stabilize, I hit him once, oh, there's Remora, oh, there's Kuchulain, and it's just like, what am I even attacking for? Like, it's started to become very frustrating. So how do you feel about bursts?
Generally, I like EX bursts. I think that some EX bursts are patently overcosted to try and make up for the fact that sometimes you'll get them for free. A really good example of that, and it's a card that I see a lot of newer players use or overuse, and I don't think a refined player or a refined deck has ever played it. It's the Ifrit from Opus 7. 4 CP.
Oh, yep.
Summon, of course, do 7,000 damage to something. If it resulted from an EX burst, do 8,000 instead. Not only is the upgrade negligible, but there's virtually no synergies to put that on top of the deck, and it's really not worth the hassle of that extra 1k. So EX bursts like that, I think, are a really good example of they cost more for the fact that they are an EX burst.
Yes.
And even cards like Brunhilde that are kind of on curve. It's an expression I like less and less these days because curve means a different thing every opus.
Right.
But like, once upon a time, paying 3 CP for a 7k forward was the norm, and so paying 3 CP for 7k removal was the norm, but Brunhilde sometimes you would get for free as an EX burst. Right. And for a really long time, I was kind of tilted that if I attacked too much, I would get hit by these, and then it dawned on me that I never need to attack, you know? Delving back into the ranks of my memory, one of the best games I've ever witnessed of FFTCG was against the reigning world champ at the time, Toby Henriette, and Robert Phillips, the UK's lovable... Can I say loudmouth? I don't know. I don't mean it in a bad way. You can hear him across the room, but yeah, they were in the finals of the Ice Crystal Cup. This was at the very tail end of Opus 7, and it was one of the most amazing games I've ever seen. If memory serves correctly, it was like YRP against Water Wind standard units.
Okay.
And Robert made this really astute observation of never attacking more than once per turn if he couldn't afford it. If he couldn't possibly handle receiving 2 EX bursts in a turn, stop attacking there. So keeping count of things like EX bursts in deck and understanding what cards were still likely to be in deck, it was just a really mathematical game of planning. And I saw a lot of that actually on the light stream yesterday at the time of recording, where I think there was like the final round on stream was Doga against, they're calling it Naya these days. It's like Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Yeah, it's like maybe a weird Stormish type.
Earth, Wind, and Fire, September Control, I don't know.
Yeah.
But the Earth, Wind, and Fire player at the time was not attacking Doga because 1 EX burst can completely bring Doga back into the game. 6 CB Leviathan, I'll take back my Doga. Also, you lose your pressure and your blockers.
Right.
We probably don't return a Susanoo to hand, but, you know, the fact that your EX burst in that deck are 2-for-1s or 3-for-1s and things like that, it adds to the strategy of the game where don't attack if you can't deal with the consequences. But I do feel like the EX bursts are not equally, statted out or equally distributed between elements. I know that Ice has got basically nothing in the way of EX bursts. I think it's part of the reason, but not the only reason that Ice feels underwhelming at the moment, is that they have no way to play a defensive deck. Yep.
That was a video I just did recently was why does Ice suck? And that was one of my main criticisms was it has no good EX bursts. Like, to me, the 2 best EX bursts it has are Idolus, which just gets you back a character, and Kuja still from Opus 6. Like, those are the only ones that, like, will always go off, whereas something like Chivalry, where as much as I like that summon, I've never had it do anything on a burst because it means you have to have an active blocker, and they also have to have another person who would attack. Like, it's just so specific that
basically, yeah, like the only thing it stops is maybe like second main phase Susanoo removal or something, but the times that comes up are minimal, and I feel like the EX burst is just not important. It should have gone the Belias way of drawing a card or something, for the fact that you're still paying 2 for it from hand. So
well, and that's
Ice's EX bursts do not seem well designed because they're always just dull and freeze a thing, and what if you don't care about dulling and freezing a thing, you know?
Yeah. Well, and water, a lot of water stuff lately is, regardless of what else it does, draw a card, you know? Even if they didn't have, like, Remora, draw a card, Kukulane, you can use it on your own forward, draw a card, you know?
One of my favourite decks in recent times was the 7CP Lightning, and removing a couple of your opponent's forwards, and then you Kukulane your own Lightning when it's about to be removed from the field, and then your opponent doesn't get those things back. So I think that water summons are better designed, but yeah, there's no denying that they draw a lot of cards.
Yeah, they do draw a lot of cards. Well, so you kind of mentioned water. We'll move away from EX Burst, because I definitely wanted to talk about elements, because that's always been a funny thing in the community. Like, elements are such a core part of the game, and for me, it's something I've always personally liked, just like in nature. I like that, the 4 elements of the world, earth, fire, wind, water. If you're watching Captain Planet, then heart is the 5th one. But in the game, you know, they are very much tied into the mechanics of the game. To cast a fire card, you must have fire CP. You know, there's not just this blank CP that you can cast anything with. And they used to have very defined attributes. You know, lightning and fire had access to haste, maybe wind did a little bit too. Ice was your dull element, earth was your brave element, you know, water was your draw a card element. And obviously they've kind of started to bleed it a little more as we've gotten more and more. But I'll hear you.
Homogenous as you go on, yeah.
Yes.
I don't mean to rain on anybody else's parade, but I think that the color pie is equally weak in the Pokemon card game, because I don't think that effects are distributed equally. Even looking back at the base set and stuff, and there's still a lot of the patterns true today, you get grass Pokemon evolve faster, which is a much bigger advantage than fire gets 20 more damage, but they have to discard their own energy, you know? And I feel like there are certain parallels in FFTCG. You've got to keep your elements flavorful. There is no point in having elements at all other than a cost restriction if they don't do something that kind of relates to their color or relates to their symbol. I want to feel like my fire cards are Fire-Againg my opponent and burning them away. I want to feel like Lightning has got some kind of Odin Norse strength to it, but it's very difficult to do that from a game design point of view and make everything feel like it's just about equally viable or even has some kind of rock, paper, scissors relationship between the elements.
See, it's great you have other trading card game backgrounds. I haven't played Pokemon since it first came out. Same with Yu-Gi-Oh! So, like, my memory of them is years and years ago, so I don't know what modern Pokemon is like. So that's a great place to start. So let's do an easy one, for example, Lightning. I've heard you talk about that before. A lot of people think Lightning is very weak right now. Talk to me about Lightning. You know, obviously one of its key attributes is that it has to target active forwards. Is that something they should move away from? I like that because I think it makes it unique, but is that going to be too weak? Or what is Lightning missing as an element? Or do you agree? Do you even think that it is kind of weak right now?
Lightning is weak. Lightning is proven to be weak. Going back to the start of the Opus 14 format, there wasn't a single Lightning card, and I'm including dual element cards, not a single piece of Lightning in the top 16 of the R4 tournament right at the start of the Opus. And I feel like that's for a reason, you know? There was an old Elvis Presley album called 50 Million Elvis Fans Can't Be Wrong, and I always use that as an example in like statistical analysis, you know? If something has got 50 million fans, it's probably good, no matter whether you like it or not. Likewise, if nobody's playing Lightning in a top cut of a tournament, there is probably a reason that they are sinking below the ocean floor level. So, yeah, there was another discussion I had. I swear all I do is talk about this card game. I was talking to someone a few days ago about the Lightning cards that are standalone good cards, basically packageless, you know? Mm-hmm. You don't have other dependencies. There are no other cards that you are obligated to include if you wanted to play such and such. And after thinking about this list of cards for about half an hour, there were 3 names in the list.
Do tell.
And let me see. Opus XII Legend Gilgamesh. I think that is a really good card. I think it is good because it's flexible, it kind of presents you a little bit of inevitability, it gives you a sort of a CP sink if you want to break damaged forwards, but it's basically guaranteed to extort a 2-for-1 from your opponent. If your opponent spends removal trying to get it out of the way, you just pop it in response and take their best thing off the board. And now they're, you know, CP on interaction down, as well as losing their best thing off the field. So those kind of cards they exist in all other elements. You look at Braska's Final Aeon and the hoops you have to go around so that you don't just lose to that. You look at even simpler things that just draw cards, like Doga. Doga is basically a 1 for none. You put 3 cards in, you get 3 cards out, you just slapped a card down on the table for basically no CP exchange, but you got more information out of it, and you turbocharge your graveyard and all that kind of stuff. So I feel like Lightning is cripplingly short on cards that... I'm not necessarily looking for it to do stuff for free, but I want to know that I'm going to get value out of it, and there's basically no way to not get value out of Gilgamesh. Lightning needs more cards like that. And I don't mean it's big, or I don't mean it can pop during the opponent's turn, or even break effects. I do think break effects are probably better than damage effects, and probably better than targeting active or dull forward specifically, just because you've got a wider range of targets. But Gilgamesh is like the one card Lightning has that I think is mechanically unique, and you never feel too bad about playing it. Even if your opening hand is garbage and you play a backup on turn 1 and a Gilgamesh on turn 2 because there was nothing else you could do, I'm pretty sure I'm going to do multiple points of damage with that Gilgamesh and eventually kill something, maybe to push for lethal. So, Gilgamesh I think is like far and away the best Lightning card. I'm probably going to include the dual element cards in there because I don't think any of the Lightning ones are good enough for how restrictive their costs are.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up perfectly, because one of my issues, when I was doing my deck techs this season, this Opus, I wanted, of course, to make something out of Al Cid and the Ice Lightning because it was the new big thing, and I couldn't. That was something I struggled with. Was there is no Lightning forward of 4 cost or less, so unfortunately Gilgamesh is excluded, that I would want to put out at any time. Like Aranea is only good at damage 3. Kuja only makes sense if they have a forward of 3 or less. And so I really struggled, like, why is there no like just generic Lightning forward that like, I just want to slam this out at any time for 4 cost? I never found, like, I don't think there is one right now. They all have a restriction or a situation they want to be good in. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was like, I don't know what to play off, because the best thing to play off them is Zero Miss, but that's another dual element. Like, if it's exclusively looking for a Lightning card, I couldn't find one.
So yeah, and I do think that deck is reasonably powerful, but it's only really good in kind of creature bash meta, because Al Cid, for some bizarre reason, can't freeze backups. It's only forwards he freezes. So I feel like that deck is still missing a certain something, and I hope that they continue on a slow basis to print dual element cards, because I've enjoyed seeing what 2 elements look like put together. I still feel like Fire Lightning is owed a legend. Nine, the Cadet, has not really done an awful lot in my eyes, but... Yeah.
Well, and again, but similar to Lednar, like, he fits in a very specific spot, right? Like, I like 9 a lot in Cadets, but you're not going to use that outside of Cadets. So, yeah, it was weird. Some of the dual elements, like, I think of the Wind Lightning, too. Like, Kunshira is something you would use in a very specific situation. Lightning was something, like, Golbez was the most generic one, but even he has I want to deal with 2-cost cards, so if you weren't building a deck around that, Golbez doesn't actually help you. So yeah, like, some elements definitely got shafted with the no, you need very specific things for these dual elements, and other ones got like, no, you can just throw them anywhere, they're fine.
I think a big offender of that has been White Tiger, Lassie, Nimbus.
Yes.
Like, it's designed to have this really restrictive ability that you can only play it from backups if you're casting from hand, but I think there's probably an equal number of decks that are cheating it into play somehow or other, like off Al Cid or even Devout and stuff like that saw a bit of resurgence off of how powerful this one card was. And it's kind of a shame that Lightning, I don't think, has got anything that it's so good that you want to cheat it into play, you know?
Yeah.
If a card is good enough to be played fair, then it's going to be even better when it's played unfair, but that just doesn't seem to be the case for Lightning.
So is that what you would want to see with Lightning going forward? Just a more like kind of a card you would want to play at any time, or is there something else you're looking for?
I think so, yeah. In case you're interested, the other 2 cards that were on my list of really, really good Lightning cards were 4CP Kuja, although I don't know if I would just play that anytime. I think it's effective against every deck. I think that it's a really good way of sort of stabilizing against aggro when, if you were going to be taking a point of damage anyway, why not develop a body and also get something off the field at the same time? So I think that's kind of the resource swing that Lightning cards should be presenting us with. And the other card, I was tempted by 5CP Odin for a while. I do think it's a good card, but it's kind of too expensive and too fair for aggressive decks. It's basically just a damage 5 control card. So the card I settled on was 1CP Sid Previa. That feels like it could have been an Opus 1 card. Every line of text on that card is familiar, seems fitting for Lightning, and although it's not a standalone card and you can't really play it on an empty field, it just feels like a really simple upgrade to cards. It almost feels like the equipment cards that everyone says we need to get added into FFTCG. For 1 extra CP, you equip a card with haste, and I think that feels mechanically quite unique to Lightning. Still probably has the most haste outlets and the most sort of repeatable haste outlets in the game. So Sid and Mid Privia are interesting. I would maybe appreciate seeing more of a partying thing going on in Lightning, because they do have a couple of party payloads already. You've got the Ferion backup and you've got Mid Privia. I really like that deck and I really hoped it would go bigger places, but I think that when you can attack with 1 body and deal 1 point of damage, why bother attacking with 2 to deal a point of damage and half the rate at which you could be dealing damage? So that's something that I think is missing, and maybe Lightning could be the house for that. But it just doesn't have enough things that don't rely on a bunch of other dependencies.
That's fair. So I'm going to kind of segue Lightning to Ice. I know I did a video earlier about why I thought Ice sucks. I'll just get your thoughts on it as well. My main things I mentioned were the summons. Everyone always says the summons are bad, the EX bursts. But in general, most of Ice's effects have very conditional effects. You know, one of the things I mentioned in there was Zalira, which is arguably one of their best summons at 1 CP. But as Eureka pointed out, it still has 2 requirements. They have to be dull and they have to be a prime number. Like, that's a lot of conditions. Something someone had mentioned in one of my comments that really stood out to me was like, why doesn't Ice have a Bahamut 0 summon? Like, Lightning has this summon that can break a forward and dull the whole board, so basically stop an attack phase. And Lightning doesn't have that. Not Lightning. Ice has no summon that just dulls the whole board. I was like, yeah, that's kind of crazy. Like, why don't they have that? So what are your thoughts on Ice? Obviously, the most obvious answer is that it used to rely so heavily on discard, and I think you said this in one of your deck texts, was that they haven't found anything to replace that.
Exactly that, yeah. I think that might have been the Ice Lightning video I did, where there was this change in direction in the design philosophy of Ice. And but back in Opus 5 and Opus 6, basically the best deck in the format was slow mid-range Ice and then turbo Ice. 2 Thaumaturges and a Gesper turn 1, 2 Thaumaturges and a Kazusa. And mathematically, it's really, really hard to beat that kind of deck unless you rely on... Ironically, that was like the one time prior to Opus 9 that Fire was a really good deck, because they'd got backups that could help you stabilize and kill a Thaumaturge. But I think that the general feels bad of the community prompted this design change in Ice. And I think the last good discard card we got that wasn't tied to like death effects or something, it's probably Opus 7 7CP Sephiroth. And that set would have been too far along in production, too far along in design by the time of the Thaumaturge and Gesper ban to do anything about the card. But I feel like discard kind of ended there. And while discard decks can still get there and can still sometimes pull off that turn 2 Sephiroth, turn 3 special, oops, your opponent can't play the game, they're just not as consistent as bashing down with Sophie or something like that. And there was a sort of a null period of Ice, sort of Opus 9, Opus 10, where it didn't really seem to do an awful lot apart from facilitate combos with Renoa. That's probably the direction I would take Ice in. I think that Renoa is still a mechanically very unique card, but instantly recognizable, and not just because of the price tag. It's a card that it appeals to every other element. You want to be generating your plays. The easiest way to generate tempo with plays is have cool, fun, flavorful on-entry abilities, and Renoa being able to say, copy any on-entry ability. It feels like a Hearthstone card. It feels like a card from another game where you can kind of proxy it as another copy of anything on the field. And right from the moment of its printing, when you'd got Renoa Nidhogg, it's just felt like a card that was something that Ice had all unto itself. And I would love to see, but I'm pretty sure it would be very hard to balance, I would love to see Renoa's on-entry ability printed as a summon, because that feels mechanically unique to Ice, but definitely strong enough. If you can save one of your things from removal or an unfavourable block and repeat its on-entry ability, that could be crazy. I don't know how you would balance that. I think it's going to need to cost 4 CP, maybe even more than that. Please don't give it an EX. Or you could maybe try and tie together a couple of Ice's effects. Have such a summon, or any really good summon, but have it tied behind one of Ice's unique mechanics as like a precondition or something. 1 CP, summon, flicker one of your forwards. You can only cast this if an opponent has discarded a card to your summons or abilities, or controls a frozen character. Something like that rewards you for doing icy things, but also feels like the most unique Ice thing. So it's a card I've theory crafted, and I think it's only the printing logistics that have stopped us doing like a fan fiction card tournament or something.
Yeah.
I would love to see like what everyone in the YYT, the sort of core party of 16 of us or so, I would love to see what cards we make up and see how balanced they are or something. So it's going to be a project for some time to see like what would it take to make Lightning or Ice feel mechanically unique but also viable.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned that. And that was something I said was an underexplored design space in my video, was that why don't they do anything with frozen characters? So that way, even if a character is frozen and it's active, you now have a Shiva who diamond dust and they all shatter, or some other effect they have to discard. And Kyle Peters pointed out in the comments of that video that if they do that, they still need to print another effect, because if it's just that if the target's frozen, do such and such, you still have this conditional effect. So he wanted to see like a forward that says, if it's not frozen, freeze it. If it is frozen, do this other effect kind of thing. But I wish that's a space they would explore.
Break it, yeah. Yeah, there's a few things like that, and a few ice cards that I think are potentially really powerful. I do like the Eduardo backup in ice, that I think is like dull all your opponent's characters, and then you can break all dull backups or something with a special. And there's a few things there that I think they're hinting at something that's mechanically unique. Ice as well, I always associate with being the sort of home of modal summons, because it was back in Opus 5 when we first got Diabolos and Glaciolabolas, or Doom Train or whatever, that felt like the most unique thing in the game at the time. And I kind of learned how to play good FFTCG as opposed to just tossing down cards and seeing what happens, with how mathematical Fire Ice felt at the time. I loved Fire Ice FF6. In the YYT, we've all got our YYT t-shirts with our favourite card serial number on the sleeve. And for me, that's like 4048L, Legend Lock from Opus 4.
Yeah.
But it was like a combination of Lock and Glaciolabolas that taught me the game's principles. And I used to swear blind that you could not lose a game after killing a forward and forcing a discard at the same time on Glacia, because that kind of summon speed 2-for-1 was so unprecedented at the time. So I would like to feel ice cards that are... Maybe Ice could be more of a home for modal cards, because they've got like little black waltz as well and whatnot from Opus 11. And I do like the kind of modal toolbox that the Remnants can give you as well. There's probably more needs to be explored there, because slow Ice is bad at the moment and turbo Ice is boring for everyone. So I would like to see more general control payloads, or something that rewards you for the game lasting more than 4 turns.
That's fair. So let me ask you about Fire. You know, Fire used to be a big joke, at least when I started. Obviously, it's come a long way. It's gotten some crazy cards, gotten really pushed to Samurais and Braska's Final Aeon. You could argue Nails up there. It's got Susano Philly. It has so many board wipes. And as I look at a lot of those old Fire cards, you know, I don't know if... granted, I didn't play back then, so please correct me if I am wrong. But I didn't think that Fire was bad because the damage was bad. What I thought was bad was a lot of these cards had really weird downsides tied to them. Like, I think there's that summon from Opus 6 that's like, discard your entire hand, do 8,000 damage. It's like, what? Like, it's like Bahamut Fury or Neo Bahamut or something. And I remember another Fire
Neo Bahamut. It's kind of anime looking or something. Yeah, sure.
And I remember there was another...
Fire...
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, Fire was in a weird position for a while. I think there's a little bit of Discord lag there.
Yeah.
Fire had a really good matchup against Turbo Ice when it was the best deck in the format, partly because it got to play playable EX bursts without trying, and it was always a home for backups that can maybe kill small things on entry. You'd got Vivi in Opus 3, Irvine in Opus 2. Those kind of cards were, to me, quite iconic and unique, and it seemed like Fire ought to have been a really good control deck because it had such good ways of stabilizing and surviving until the late game, but its control payloads all came with downsides. Like the only card with upside that rewarded you for being in Fire was Emperor's End in Opus 2 for a really, really long time. Kill a Thaumaturge on attack.
Yeah.
So, there was this kind of grey area, I think, where Fire lost its niche of being the aggro slayer when the premier aggro deck of Turbo Ice got banned out of the format. And it wasn't until probably Opus 9 that I think it started to look good again. In Opus 8, I know there's going to be some people who say Archangel 8 Gem was the best card in the format. It didn't actually do anything. You know, like, life is a resource. The magic black mana player in me is like, life is a resource. You know, only the last point of damage matters. So... Right. Archangel 8 Gem is basically just a slow thing that hits your opponent's EX burst twice as often. So I don't think, apart from Legend Cloud in Opus 8, there was really a lot of reasons to be playing Control Fire still, and then that all changed with Nail. Nail and the ability to play really low backup decks in Opus 10 with between Geomancer in Opus 10, Dominion Legionary Opus 6 and stuff. It was only in Opus 10 that I think it started to get these results, but it's in a pretty good place since. It has a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh style cards these days.
Yeah, it seems very straightforward these days. Just burn everything to the ground, hit it for as much damage. Is there anything in Fire you'd like to see them add, or do you kind of just enjoy where it's at right now?
I think Fire is in probably a good enough place just now. I think it's got a tribal deck that still has got a strong niche. I do think that the sort of inevitability of Samurais is still probably good enough to win a locals, top a regionals, probably top a bigger event as well. The most mechanically unique in the game is Amaterasu, and while Fire is the sole owner of Amaterasu, there will always be reasons to play Fire, because every unfair interaction in the game gets stopped by Amaterasu. If you're an aggro deck and you're ahead but you're afraid of Shantoto, it keeps you alive. If you hate Doga, if you hate Verstyle, it's the one card that hates on all of these unfair things and all of these unfair oppressive tempo swings. So I think that Fire has a reason to be played, even if it is, like in this Naya control deck, just one of 3 elements making this unfair toolbox of control options. Fire has the one thing it needs, and on top of that, it's got good tools for playing aggressively, it's got good tools for playing mid-range, and it's still got cool control cards and kind of obligated 2-for-1s in Braska's Final Aeon and stuff. One thing about Fire that I find interesting, and it's a little bit of a tangent, is Marsh Ritz disappearing off the face of the earth.
Right? Man, who saw that coming?
Yeah, it was without a doubt the best deck, maybe the only deck to be playing competitively in Opus 11, and a number of little things changed. I think probably Amaterasu was the biggest one. Amaterasu was playable in that deck, but also really good against that deck, so it really sort of dried up out of nowhere, but it doesn't change that. It's just kind of a tangent there, but I think Fire has got enough that makes it mechanically unique for the time being that I wouldn't feel bad about playing Fire at a big event.
Yeah. Well,
maybe not mono Fire, but certainly Fire plus something. You can tailor the something to cover whichever of Fire's blind spots you want.
Well, and a little side note, I'm glad you brought up March Ritz and Amaterasu, and my buddy and I were discussing this. It seems like, now I don't know what their design philosophy is. You know, none of us get to talk to the designers. They don't put out like a patch notes thing where they're like, here's why we made this card, yada, yada, yada. It'd be cool to hear that. But it seems like they have a habit of printing a problem and then printing an answer later. So, for example, Amaterasu would have been really helpful against March Ritz, but it didn't come out till the next Opus. You know, everyone, of course, abhorred Neo X Death. Well, wasn't until Opus 14 that like, all right, well, here's this Shinryu card that just, you know, it and Tenzin, it just craps on both of those cards. So they do seem to have this issue of like, they print just this really problematic card, and then, well, we'll go get answers later. It's like, right, but that makes it miserable to play against in the current Opus. I don't know. Maybe that's just me speculating, but
I think a cynic might say that this is, you know, it's a capitalist economy, and they do this to keep you buying sets and stuff. And I think the solution, the more pragmatic and realistic thing is, the design pipeline is quite long. They would have known about Amaterasu being a card as Opus 11 was being shipped. You know, I don't think they are necessarily hot-fixing things one release to the next. Not that I've got any particular inroads to Square to find out their design philosophy or stuff, but the pipeline on patenting cards and playtesting them, and I do believe they are quite rigorously playtested. But it's kind of funny. It does feel like some cards are answering older cards specifically, and I think that will happen to an extent, but it's going to be on a year-long, you know, cycle rather than a one set to the next set cycle that happens.
Okay. Well,
there's maybe some chat in there about bans or ban-worthy cards, or whether something needs to be done to fix the dominant decks when we don't have the luxury of waiting for the next set, or if a problem has only been spotted in the short term, then do we ban something until we can print a solution in 3 sets time or something? So
right.
I would be more okay, or I would be okay with them doing more bans, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. We'll get to that. Yeah, I want to delve into that later. So let me finish up the elements really quick. Yeah, but we'll delve into the bans because I know that'd be a good topic. So let me jump to Earth really quick. Earth has always been just a really good, strong supporting element. It's usually where most of the color fixing was found. Mono Earth maybe is showing up for the first time.
My biggest gripe about Earth, it felt like for a really long time Earth didn't do anything that made it unique. Until they printed Sophie, I don't think there were enough reason to be playing monks. Earth kind of felt like the support element. You play your Krill, you play your Kuseth, you've got your Tyro and Shantoto, but none of those cards are the actual payload or engine of the deck. It's got to be something else that deals the 7th point of damage. So, yeah, I think Earth felt mechanically. See, it has flavorful mechanics. It's got all this graveyard recursion type stuff. You've got the ability to flashback summons and whatnot, and they feel quite unique to Earth, I suppose. Krill feels like a really well designed card, although I hated it at the time. Even Tyro, I've come to appreciate the relative slowness of Tyro, and I don't resent the card apart from when it appears as the first point of damage.
So I still resent that card, so I'm glad you've moved on.
I think that Monks is getting there for being a really good mono Earth deck, but the problem is Sophie. Sophie is a bit of an issue.
Yep. Oh, yeah. Well, so speaking of Sophie, let's go right into water. Earth Water just blew up the moment that Opus 13 came out. Before then, I don't think I really ever saw many Earth Water decks, so they definitely did their job if they wanted people to play that dual element, but...
Only at very particular weird points of history, like there were occasional, overlaps in the Venn diagram where Earth had something and Water had something, and it made an anti-meta deck. One of my fondest memories of FFTCG was my first trip abroad for the game was over to Italy for one of their Winter Cups. Nice. In probably early 2018. Wonderful community, and it's the thing that keeps me coming back to FFTCG and has made me stick with it through lockdown is how wonderful everyone I've met has been. There is practically zero of the typical card game toxicity and whatnot. Mm-hmm. It's just a really nice collection of people who are mostly in the game because they like Final Fantasy or they like games in general, and not because they want to grind out a card game and be one of those tournament spikes sitting shuffling their cards in the corner. So yeah. Italy was a really good example of exactly the jolliest parts of a card game community. But I took Earth Water to that. I'm getting tangent within a tangent.
No, it's
here.
Okay. I like to hear it.
Yeah, the Earth Water was Earth Water Monsters was kind of a cool deck then, and it had a bit of resurgence again when Thaumaturge seemed like it was the only deck worth playing, because there were some really odd cards like Flandit that was really good at taxing aggressive decks that didn't have the luxury of CP.
Yeah.
Turbo Ice played between 3 and 9 backups in the deck, only 3 unique names. They couldn't really afford to deal you the 7 points of damage in time if they were being Flandited from turn 2. So right. I like it when weird decks like that popped up, but maybe it's a case of Doga, Sophie, Sarah Mobius being too pushed in their design.
Yeah, absolutely. So with Water specifically, and it seems like we have somewhat different metas, over here versus over there. We got this new Leviathan Primal. They really kind of tried to push bounce more as a mechanic. How do you see where Water's at right now?
Where Water is at just now, I don't think there is any reason to play mono Water other than I just really like mono Water.
Yeah.
Basically anything that Water could be doing, Water plus something else does better.
Yeah.
The specific interaction between Primal Leviathan and Althea, if you wanted to make a Primal Leviathan control deck that, locks your opponent out of the game and generates value through bounces, you do that so much better through Althea than through anything that Water has on its own. Indeed, better than... I think that probably that is the highest value deck if you just want to make, a miserable time for your opponent. You play Water Wind and try and find a way to survive past turn 5. So... I think that, anything Water could do, Water plus something does a little bit better. I do think Primal Leviathan's a really good card. I have won games by casting it off of no backups just because it solved a bunch of problems at once.
Yeah.
I can't believe that is the case, but it's a strong enough card that it didn't feel like the worst play in the world for me to pitch 5 cards and play a Primal Leviathan. And I think I won that turn by bouncing a backup, killing a thing, and dealing damage that my opponent thought I couldn't possibly because I'd opened miserably. But... I think that Primal Leviathan is a well-designed card, but just about slow enough that you've got to be bouncing the right things. And keeping on going back to Doga Sophie, it's not a perfect solution against that deck because you have to bounce things in a really weird pattern. If you bounce the Ursula back to hand, you might as well not kill the Sophie,
Right.
So it's an interesting card for like politics of drawn-out games, and I kind of wish there was more of that in FFTCG. I enjoy the control metas more than the aggro metas because I feel like there is more room for the person who is more skilled or planned it out better to win, rather than who got the better opening hand. But, that's an oversimplification. There's a lot of skill goes into Doga, particularly where Mastery is concerned. Same for Verstale. There's what you pick off of the Celtius reveal really changes the flow of the game. But I feel like I would rather have more turns in which to make those kinds of decisions.
That's fair. Well, so you mentioned Althea, which is one of my most hated cards, because Althea turns Leviathan from this card's fair into this isn't fair. That's not fair at all. So wind we'll touch on last, and wind has always been one of my personal hated elements just because I've always felt like it just does too much too freely. Like I've always felt like it gets, whereas ice is limited to dull and freezing and earth gets brave. Wind is like, I'll tell you what, I can do straight break, I can do board wide damage, I can do backup destruction, I can do unblockable, I can do haste. It's like, oh my goodness, is there anything it doesn't do? So how do you feel about wind?
I think that wind does have too much. It doesn't really have any identity of its own because it's too good at approximating the identities of other elements. Mm-hmm. The biggest problem in wind, maybe, is free stuff, What card game isn't just dominated by, I can play free stuff? Even cards that basically have no text, like Vata and Bart's and whatnot, there's so many implications to playing one of those cards at the right time. The first event I've been to post-lockdown over in the UK was not a reunion event, but that kind of thing. 5 rounds of sweating to Top Cut and stuff. And I took mono wind because I felt like it was in a really good flexible spot. I probably lose to Doga, but I know what to do to maybe buy myself some time in those kind of games. But I just love the decision trees you have once you're past turn 4 or something like that. The fact that Bart's lets you get all your Bismarck pings and then restand everything when you let his on-entry ability resolve. I just love those kind of odd implications and having the Fiona back up as a search toolbox and stuff. So I enjoy playing it because it can do so much, but from the point of view of any deck on the other side of the table who has a less ambitious game plan, it must be really frustrating to see my cards can ping removal for free and without expending cards. It's the very same principle that made Dadaluma Cactuar so good. Yeah. You've got like 8k, maybe 12k removal every single turn on your opponent's board, even during their turn, but you don't have to expend cards to do it. The cards you are drawing are just for protecting your board or bolstering your board, helping deal that extra damage. And the actual removal part of the deck is cardless. It's an ephemeral concept that your opponent's deck is going to go down the plug hole eventually. And wind gets a bit of that, but it also gets a bit of negation and protection and discard. Yeah. Zidane, or Zidane, I don't know how you pronounce it on your side of the pond, but that's one of the most hated cards. Again, I like it because I like having that little bit of control over whatever part of the game. I think that Zidane or wind mirror matches are intensely skilled because it so often comes down to who took the wrong thing, who did the wrong thing first, will go on to lose.
Well, so go ahead. Yeah. Please finish.
Wind just basically has a little bit too much of everything, and the crown jewel of having too much of everything is Althea, because inevitability will lie with you. Rather than Dadaluma Cactuar taking 2 cards to give you this cardless removal situation, Althea gives you extra cardless copies of whatever you want, and it doesn't even need to be a wind card. And I'm quite sure that Althea is one of those rare exceptions to playtesting that has slipped through the net. I know it was probably designed as a way to replay your characters, but it just feels way too free to use. It's in an exploitable job, in an exploitable category, at a convenient cost, with a relevant on-entry ability a lot of the time, and I feel like it either needed a CP cost attached to the action ability, pay 1 CP and tap Althea and return something to hand. That needed to be the case, or Althea needed to cost more to be lower tempo and more vulnerable to interaction, I suppose. Maybe not have an on-entry ability as well, just be a recursion mechanism. Or maybe the most abstract idea, I feel like wind has got returning to hand as one of its core mechanics as well. You've got Chocobo, you've got Bismarck, you've got Mayune. All of those cards are of a very high power level. Yeah. Personally, I'm not convinced they should be banned because they are fairly standalone effects, but returning to hand, if we assume that is part of Wind's colour pie, I've got to look historically at the reasons these cards have been played. Like, Chocobo was one of the most pivotal cards at the last World Championships that ran in 2019,
November 2019.
Yeah. It just feels like so long ago now, I can't remember. Chocobo was so pivotal because it let you kind of counterspell a lot of your opponent's removal. Ranper was the big deck at the time. 7 CP Fusoya was one of the big cards in Ranper because the average cost of your deck was so high. But you completely turn that game on its head if you Chocobo bounce a card back to hand that your opponent didn't see coming, and now they don't draw 2 cards off the Fusoya.
Yep.
So I feel like Wind's identity is not really about returning stuff to hand, but it was about rescuing cards, So you could maybe errata Althea to be a rescue card. It can return something to hand, but only if it's currently being chosen by one of your opponent's effects. Kind of abstract, I suppose, and a very hard sell to new players who don't get stacking, maybe. Yeah. But I feel like that's what they were trying Althea to be. It was a way to save your forwards, and instead it's a way of crushing your opponent through the grim inevitability of the far future.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a card that they could have done so much. Like, they could have made it so that it breaks when you use it. They could have said you can only use it on your turn, so that way you can't really dodge stuff as easily with it.
Yeah. I feel like the fact that you can use it proactively or reactively is what gives Althea its late game strength. And again, it's possibly a good thing that it's down to you as a player to make the most skilled decision you can, but it's just not fun for decks that don't have something so powerful, so flexible, and so indefatigable in their card pool, you know?
Normally, I like the stack as a mechanic, and obviously that originated in Magic the Gathering, but there are times, and Althea is an example of one of these cards, and we'll get to some other cards later that do this, that makes me hate the stack, because it's like, no matter what I do, you will always be able to Althea protect it. So the only way for me to like stop it is I have to wait for you to Althea, then do my effect on top, which, as you know, only matters if you're ahead. If you're behind, you'll never have the luxury of doing that. They'll always have the, no matter what you do, there goes Althea back to my hand. So,
well, the problem I see with Althea as well, I think that returning her to hand should have been part of the cost. And while that does make her a little bit more immune to things like Hecatoncheir, I find it very odd that Althea only returns to hand upon resolution of the ability. The only cost for the ability is declare the target and dull Althea. Meaning, if your opponent snipes the target in response, Althea stays on the field. Yeah. And I feel like that it's just too easy to keep the Althea on the field, and you might as well do it recklessly because you're not losing all that much if it goes wrong. So it's little things like that, and which side of a word the semicolon for costs, costs versus effects is on, it makes such a huge impact.
It really does. Well, so those are all the elements we touched on. I'm glad you kind of said all that. And I'm kind of going to chain off of what you just said about Althea and cards being free, and we'll kind of move into that in general. John Schreiner of the RVA has a phrase he always says, if it's for free, it's for me. And he's 100% right. If you look at the Worlds, what did Ranpier do? It put in a 9-cost Shantoto for free. Crazy, right? Same with that Rain. Once you got enough WAF characters down, it was free. March Ritz. Here comes March. Ritz comes in for free. Then she gives you CP back by attacking. Look at Sophie, the Big Terror. It doesn't cost anything. Like, when you just play it off of Lena and you play it off Ursula and you play it off of Fenrir, it seems like the cards that are free, that they don't cost you anything, they always rise to the top, because how could you ever hope to keep up when you have to honestly pay 3 CP, 5 CP, 7 CP for your cards, and all of mine don't cost anything?
I think that, going back to the weaker elements, I think that's what Lightning and Ice are missing. They have probably got the least free stuff and the least ways of generating CP.
Yeah.
It's honestly laughable to think of cards like Physalis or Physalis. I don't know where you stress the vowel over in NA, but Physalis needs to be under very precise conditions to either dull and freeze a character or draw a card. And comparing that to Sophie, who is, 40% of the price and does all of this stuff, practically wins the game on the spot for you, it just doesn't seem like... Is there something we're missing that Hobby Japan knows that we don't? I don't know.
That's a great point. Well, no, and Alex Scott of Mysidia Gaming, he plays the game she's from, so he says it's pronounced Physalis. So who knows if that's right. But she was a card I mentioned too, is that she's a cool legend and she has undoubtedly a great special, but legit her effect can just not even work if they have too many cards in hand. And when you have cards like Sophie that draw your hand full, I just don't understand it. Yeah, you said it perfectly. Is there something we're missing here? Is there some secret that all of us haven't unlocked? Because we can't find it.
It's another gripe I have as well about end phase, and the sort of end phase of a turn being a mechanic of increasing importance. First we had Kadaj, and you can't respond to Kadaj re-entering the field when he re-enters the field, because that's during the end of turn. You can't just hold back all your mana to snipe it at a particular point, because the phases at which you can and can't interact with Kadaj are very problematic. Even Kadaj re-enters the field and then chooses 2 cards in your break zone, you can't crack a Luminous Puma or Kusith to rescue one of those cards. And at the time, Kadaj felt really annoying because it dodged a lot of the sorcery speed or during your own turn board wipes. But my biggest problem with Kadaj going onwards is it just feels stupid that players don't get priority during this end of turn step. And I know that in Magic, nothing good ever comes of, oh, wait, before you end your turn, I'm going to do something on your end step. And same for upkeep and stuff. I actually like the reduced pools of priority in FFTCG, but I wish the template was consistent, and either nothing happens during end of turn, or everything does. Because, reverting back to my topic on Ice a moment ago, I loved Scale Toad. I thought Scale Toad was a very cool card. It was actually costed. Taxing your opponent so that they will eventually only be floating one card between turns was very good at sort of removing the unpredictability or removing these summon speed decks, which is what Ice was supposed to be preying on for a really long time. But it annoys me that the way that the stack works, Sophie's going to draw a card and Tenzen's going to pull a card out of deck after Scale Toad has already resolved. And it really annoys me that what felt like one of the most mechanically unique cards to Ice and taxing your opponent's hand in a fairly fair and transparent way basically got nerfed into oblivion by this end of turn strange phase that players don't have access to, but the broken cards do, you know?
Yes.
It's a problem I don't know how you fix, other than saying we promise not to ever do this ever again. And I don't really trust anyone at their word to do that anymore.
Right. Well, and it is frustrating to have an answer. So, to, for example, have an Amaterasu in hand that could deal with that Kadaj, that could hit that Sophie, but you're not allowed to use it. So it's like, I even though I have the answer in my, like, I'll never forget a game I saw on Opus XI where my buddy Steven took on my friend Alex from Acidia, and the Kadaj re-entered, and he had, he was playing a monster deck. He had the Gao that could, like, dull itself to use Rage, and it, like, broke a forward. No. And he comes in, and he dulls the guy. He's like, all right, Kadaj, dull the Gao. And he's like, okay, well, I'm going to use, the Rage. It's like, no, you can't use that. So it's like, so even though he has the answer to it, he's not allowed to do it. What? How is that fair? Like,
it's an interesting comment on specials as a whole, and specials that involve dulling. I really like that they're mechanically flavorful and they've all got names that are relevant to the source material and stuff, but the opportunity cost of playing all of these duplicate name specials in your deck is something that I think they've found very hard to balance. Yeah. And there's only a couple of specials that I say you will regularly see in competitive play because the cost is so restrictive when Kadaj can just say no.
Yeah, exactly. So, no, I agree. I part of me does understand why they did the whole end of turn thing, because I think they wanted to have effects that, no, we want this effect to go off, so we don't want you to be. And again, for some cards it makes sense, like for Lakshmi, I think that makes sense that she's in the end phase, because if that card doesn't draw, that card doesn't do anything. It's under curve. Its whole existence is there to draw you a card. So if you could just negate that, that would feel really bad. But things like Neo X Death or Kadaj or Sophie, that you just can't affect that. You just lose, whatever. And again, there's some weird interactions too, where you have cards like the 5 CP Arden from Opus 11, where, well, if he chooses Neo X Death and sacks himself, he won't return until the next end of turn because you've already started this end of turn, even though he begins at the end of turn. I don't know. It's just kind of strange.
Rules process nightmare, I suppose, and it's a hard thing to stress to newer players, and even like the timing window of not responding to EX bursts. Yes. I don't know how many times, even as recently as locals this week for me, I'll hit an EX burst and I'll say that dies, and my opponent's like, okay, think, and I'm like,
you can't respond to that.
You don't need to think. Feel free to think, but you can't do anything.
Yeah.
It's an odd rule, and one that seems kind of at odds with a lot of the summons. Things like 2CP Titan from Opus 1 that can save forwards from dying and stuff. I get that a lot of the time people are expecting that their answer will do something, but yeah, the strange windows in FFTCG when you can and can't do things, it takes some getting used to, particularly if you've played a lot of Magic.
Yeah. Oh, so Typhon, and we can use this as a segue into like bans and stuff, but again, Typhon, a unique effect, and guess what got it? Wind. Wind always gets the good monsters, and he was a card that, as I've played against it, and I don't know how you would possibly balance this other than to ban things like Mione, but it's like, I can kind of deal with one Zidane or one Typhon, but when it's replayed on me every turn and they're just ripping my hand to shreds and every forward I have goes, oh, well, it doesn't work with your Leviathan because it's not a bounce. Oh, and it doesn't go to the break zone, so you don't get that effect. So it just like shuts off any effects a card. It's just, it feels really bad.
I think so, yeah. My biggest gripe about Typhon is it should have been an ice card. And not because of Typhon itself or the character of Typhon, but we've already had Return to Deck as an ice mechanic in the Legend of Maro in Opus 11. Yes. And I loved that card. I think a lot of the time it felt shockingly close to remove 2 forwards from the game. One gets frozen, maybe forever, one gets returned to deck. And on top of that, it felt like a fun ice card to Renoa or stuff like that. Yeah. So I feel like Typhon really should have been an ice card because... Not just because ice has nothing, but it already felt like a mechanic that was established there. But no, wind gets it because I'm blowing your stuff away. I don't know. I don't know if I would class it as a flavor win or a flavor fail. The card is strong. I think that it's basically Zidane levels of good and will probably stand the test of time just as well. I think that the monsters that become forwards when you control 3 backups of that particular element, they are of shockingly different power levels. I find it bizarre that Mom Bomb and
the Valdefinor,
Val Order. I thought it was called Valfor at first, and I thought, whoa, we've got another one. No, it's Valfodder. It's got a few extra consonants in there. But yeah, they are embarrassing when you look at them alongside Typhon, and that's the only way I can say it. Like, the number of ways of playing around those effects, I feel like Valfodder should have discarded a card on entry or been multi-playable, but no. It's bizarre to me, and Typhon is so good, because Wind's one weakness, all the way back to Opus 1, whatever, it really had to work for spot removal. It didn't have any. You had to use shaky cards like Death Gaze from Opus 8 to maybe remove something from the game, but only if your opponent is not playing monster removal.
Chaos Walker of the Wheel.
Chaos Walker of the Wheel, which again you had to work around. Yeah. So it feels really weird that all of a sudden we get this insanely powerful, greater than curve stat line on a body that you can sometimes use an Althea and stop it being a forward just to save it from removal. And it just feels like it fits too neatly into the repeat and on-entry ability stuff of Wind. Again, I don't think I could class any Wind deck as being tier 1 just now, while Verstale and while Doga are being so heavily played, but the inevitability of Wind is completely unfair, and I don't think any non-Wind deck and non-aggro deck can compete with what Wind is doing. So,
the fact, too, with that Typhon, that it doesn't become a forward based on your backup line is actually an advantage for that player, because like you said, they can mess with their backups and dodge removal, or you're gonna Susano, you're gonna board wipe me, hey, he's not a forward anymore, so too bad. Like,
brilliant example yesterday at locals. I was playing Ice Wind, loved the deck. I was playing against Mono Wind, I loved the deck, but their Typhon was always a forward and mine wasn't always. And the fact that I could Typhon their Typhon but they couldn't do it back was just funny. I don't know. It seemed to strike a very strange chord with me at the time. And I don't object to bury back to deck effects. I think it's a lot closer to remove a card from the game than it is to, returning to hand or something, because ultimately your opponent is being deprived of a new card. You are deleting something from existence, and a couple of turns later, unless they shuffle, they're just redrawing the same information they already had, but they have to pay for it again. It's ridiculously efficient how strong that card is at denying stuff. I actually really quite like Return to Deck as a mechanic, even on like the new 6EP Leviathan card. The number of times I've won games by bouncing a dark or light card back to the top of the opponent's deck and screwing them out of 2 CP they would have drawn that turn. I think it's a really strong card and something I would like to see explored more, but it should be something Ice has. It's a form of resource denial, and if Ice was meant to be the resource denial and they've had 2 slightly failed ways of making Ice deny resources in a fun or balanced way, why not fail a third time, We
need to get that on a plaque, what Steve just said. It is a form of resource denial. Why is it not nice? That's a great point. So, speaking of light and dark, for anyone who doesn't know, I'm not really enjoying Opus 14 right now, and a big part of that, from a gameplay perspective, is Mashri and Stern Leonis. We got 2 really neat legends in this card, in this element, this set, in Omega and Shinryu, and no one even cares about them because they don't seem like the legends. They seem like they should have been the heroes, because Mashri and Stern Leonis are just like, there's just this, you said inevitability, there is this deflating feeling of facing these cards that the moment they come down, I just think, oh, I lose. It doesn't matter what state the game is in. It doesn't matter what I can do. And this, again, they're another example of this, is who I was alluding to earlier, of the stack. They abuse the stack because there is nothing you can do to come out ahead of those. You can miss Dragon, say, I'm going to take away all your ammo. They'll say, okay, well, in response, I'm just going to fire off all that ammo. So I can't accurately describe how deflating it is to play against these cards. And decks, the 2 main decks you mentioned, Doga and Verstale, right? They don't care about those summons and those forwards, especially Verstale. It wasn't, that's Chocobos as a deck has come back because of one card, Stern Leonis, because, well, they weren't using all those Chocobos anyway. So thanks for the free the resources you now have used twice. I already used it once to pay for whatever, and now it's like, I'll go on forever. Please cut in.
Yeah, I really liked the look of using your break zone as an additional resource at first, but I feel like it was fair on Celtius. I played a bit of Celtius in like Fire Ice FF6 because there wasn't a lot of break zone recursion there. Sometimes I would scholar back a lock for a special or something like that, but generally speaking, when I got to 5 forward in the break zone, I was like, sweet, I can do some dredge stuff now. I can play a forward from deck using something other than CP. That's just pure advantage. The advantage got too pure. It's like Walter White's meth. It's a little bit too much now. It's 99.7% pure, and there's kind of no going back from that point because say my name, Versatile.
Yeah, right.
It's the using anything other than a card to pay for something that isn't in your hand is very powerful. And again, it's really hard to stress this to new players, but there is a certain parallel between Stern Leonis and Mashery and a pair of iconic Opus 1 summons. Stern Leonis can create Burnhilders out of nowhere. Mashery can create Opus 1 Leviathans out of nowhere. And that is the least of what they can do. It's not all they can do.
Yeah.
If a card draw or summon reduction or a board buff benefits you more, you can do that instead. But as a baseline, I think that having a pseudo-unlimited supply of just as instant speed, 0 CP, Burnhilders and Leviathans that aren't part of your hand is a huge advantage. And I really think that Light and Dark didn't entirely feel worth playing in a deck considering the risks for a very long time. In Opus 1, they were kind of bad. In Opus 2, they were kind of bad. There's cards like Fasoya that have had an archetype around them, but they were never cards you would just splash in for the fun of it, you know? And that maybe kind of changed in Opus 7 when Yuri Wind became really good. And I think since Yuri Wind, pretty much every set, a better Light or Dark card has come out that has completely revolutionized the game. And I didn't think things would ever get better again after Citra. Citra genuinely fits in any deck other than, ironically, Versatile style decks that are just playing forwards and backups. The number of things you can recur, I didn't think it would get better than Guldi's and how flexible he was in Opus 7 as well. But, not for the first time, and I'm sure not for the last time. I really feel with Mashery and Stern, they are so pushed. They are so pushed that I genuinely fear what could be better than cardless Leviathans and Burnhilders to smite your opponent's board with. And the flexibility, I feel like Mashery wouldn't be half the threat if she was only limited to bouncing one player's forwards. If you could only bounce your opponent's forwards, then you'd have no qualms about just killing the Mashery on sight. If she could only bounce your own stuff, then you're probably better off like misdragoning their break zone, because the worst they can do is draw a bunch of cards, or what are they going to do, return their own board to hand? No. But the flexibility of Mashery is scary, and it's not the first time I've said, whoa, this will be hard to power creep. I'm sure they might.
Right.
But yeah, it's daunting, and I feel like you're not really giving yourself the best chance to win in FFTCG at the moment if you are not playing these cards or expressly building with them in mind.
And that's not even counting their generic cost reductions that they have on them. That Stern Leonis says, hey, that Physalis, that Versatile, you can play it off of 2 cards now. You don't need that 5th CP anymore. That Mashery says, yeah, all these summons are 1 cheaper. I can now misdragon you off of a single card in hand, which we saw at R4. The dude literally Mashery'd, drew 1 card. Oh, it was misdragon. Cool. Cast it with the last card in my hand to cancel your misdragon. And, you mentioned Celtius. Look how restricted Celtius was. They have to be fire and ice cards. Then it's going to reveal, so there's an inherent riskiness there because it might not hit, and then it's only 5 or less. Like 3 restrictions right there. Mashery or Stern, same with Althea, limit it to it has to be on your turn. You can only do it once per turn. Like, you could have limited these in any way. Instead, no, you can just freely dump 16 cards out of your break zone to blow up their entire board, or to give you, or to survive a Susano, because okay, well, I'll just give myself 12,000 Brave, no big deal. Like, it's so frustrating.
I would love to see what the testing is like for these kind of cards at Hobby Japan or whatever, and I can only assume that when they tested Mashery, it was in a very standard kind of deck. 23 forwards, 10 summons, 17 backups kind of thing.
Yes.
Because I am not at all against playing weird decks or decks with weird structures that deviate from that kind of formula. I genuinely find it very interesting when there was like 12 forward mill as one of the dominant decks in Opus 9 that prompted the Riku ban. And I thought that was very interesting at the time, and I should, by all purposes, like Doga for being some forwards, mostly zombie type stuff that comes back from the break zone, and then all these summons, because it just defies the rules in such an odd way. And I played a lot of those kind of decks in Magic, but I think I've come to the epiphany that Magic is the place for those kind of things, and in FFTCG, just about every deck is still trying to win through conventional means. We're not seeing too many alternative win conditions like Sin's special. Whether you're playing a control deck or an aggro deck, it's by dealing 7 damage. And so when you get these odd kind of esoteric decks that exist within their own means and they've got their own rules of playing, it just doesn't feel like all decks have got that same information or that same ability to be constructed in such a way. And the solution is not to print more Dogas in every color combination, it's to probably take some kind of action against it.
Yeah, so let's get into that, and I'm going to touch on your light dark point, because I started playing close to the end of Opus 7. So what I saw was Opus 8 started, Veritas was in every deck ever, because I was like, oh, you can put this card anywhere. And then Opus 9 actually took a break. No one really used the Wall of the Chaos, thank goodness. Opus 10 comes out, Citra and Reagan are like, holy cow. And then you have Heian too, the Dark special. And I remember, I think Alex Hancock wrote in his write-up, like, it's hard to imagine Heian ever disappearing because he can protect himself. And here comes Kadaj. It's like, hey, how about a card that can't be interacted with like in any way? It's like, oh my goodness. Then you get Neo X Death and Lena, and then 13 took a step back with like Spiritus and Materia, and then so for 14 like, oh no, we're giving you the good stuff and Mashari and Stern Leonis. So,
going back to printing 4 of these bad boys.
Yeah, insane. So speaking of Doga, and again, what's funny about Doga is that, like you, I think it's a neat idea. Hey, what if you just jam a bunch of summons? Because traditionally those have never really worked. And I think most people can agree that even though everyone calls it the Doga deck, because that's what they see in all the summons, Sophie's really the problem, right? Because if you take out Sophie, how much weaker does that deck get? That now you can't have this insane play. And if you haven't seen it, check out Steve's video he did recently on, I think it was it Archetypes or was it Styles? Basically it talked about like aggro control, tempo, mid-range, the different like styles of play. Great video. Sure. He shows a little graph, and all these decks are what they call aggro. And normally, I'm not an aggro player. I'm a mid-range player. I hate aggro, but old aggro, I didn't mind in the sense that it went all in, and then if you stopped it, you won the game because they had to go all in to do that. But this current aggro with Doga or Verstale is, hey, I'm going to present 4 forwards, and I still have 5 cards in hand. Is that cool with you? Everyone knows the Doga play. You put out Doga, you draw 3 cards, you put out Ursula, get back your Sophie. Your opponent hasn't taken a turn yet, and they've already taken a point of damage. There's 3 forwards on the board, and your opponent still has 3 cards in hand.
And that's the bit that gets me. Going back to Opus 1, when I still think you could play aggressive decks and control decks and stuff like that, ever since Opus 1, I have never lost a game of FFTCG in which my opponent played 2CP Tifa. The 2CP Tifa that is just a 4K with haste, and everyone at the time was saying, it's like Lightning Bolt in Burn in Magic or something, it's an aggro card, I'm just going to play this on turn 1 and see what happens. Mm-hmm. And I feel like losing 2 cards out of your starting hand, or out of any hand, to go, there's CP, there's a Tifa that doesn't actually affect the board state and is trivially easy to block or kill, I've just won the game because my opponent has traded away 4 CP of resources for the first point of damage, and by goodness, it will be their last.
Yeah.
So that kind of mentality is what a lot of people think aggro means. You can't really win in FFTCG nowadays because there are too many board wipes and there are too many preventative mechanisms, I suppose. There are too many ways to stabilize against dumb aggro. No offense to the Tifa husbandos out there. Your waifu is still valid, but the card has never been good, and playing that kind of aggro just doesn't really work outside of your opponent not drawing into a hand that lets them play a convincing game. And Doga sets that apart because the Doga itself, you're discarding 3 cards to draw 3 cards, you might as well have just put the Doga into play. It is an actual 0 CP body that is bigger than Tifa, but will scale to be bigger, and sometimes lets you generate free CP on attack as well. And then on top of that, Sophie's just absurd. It might as well have double strike and drawing a card each turn. It is laughable how much work a Wind player has to do to make their Opus 12 Legend Ash draw a 3rd card per turn, compared to what Sophie has to do. And that, again, it feels like Sophie was probably play tested. I think that Mono Earth Monks featuring Sophie is a really good deck. Tier 1 if you want to talk in tiers, but you have to work towards that goal. You actually have to plan out and sculpt a hand. You're not going to do it on turn 1 or turn 2. It takes a degree of cooperation from your opponent to not be Amaterasuing the triggers, or sometimes they won't damage you on purpose just so you don't get the Yang live and you have to shoot yourself with a Cecil or a Dark Knight or something. That's interesting because it's a tier 1 deck where there is cooperation, there is planning, there is logic, there is thought, there is baiting and counterplay and stuff, and the reward is worthwhile. It's a card that you have cheated into play that you otherwise have very limited ways of getting into play unless you've got like Tyro or Shantotto down or something, and the reward feels very strong and worth that effort and just short of broken. But when you can do it on turn 1 and the restrictions are minimal, I really think that Sophie was not play tested in an unfair deck like that. I strongly suspect that they tried it out in an Earth-Water kind of good stuff deck. Going to shout out Chris Matiski, who had probably the best example of those in Opus 13. And then Opus 14, I think Mono Earth Monks is better basically because of Mont Leonis. Right. So Mont Leonis is a really good tribal payload, and I would love to see more cards like Mont. Flavorful, really, really big reward for playing what is more or less a mono deck. So that is what I consider to be the optimal Monks deck now, not the Water Earth variant. But yeah, the Doga deck would be nerfed a lot if Sophie had been balanced around being played fairly in mind. Like, I feel like she should draw a card or shoot your opponent for damage, or maybe you can pay some amount of CP to do both, because that would shut out the aggro decks. Aggro decks don't have spare CP to play with. So the problem is you just do too much aggression by compromising pretty much nothing. You don't have to give up something to play aggressively with that kind of deck. And that's entirely the problem. Yeah.
I couldn't have said it better yourself. Again, another example, like, they could have done any restriction on her. A lot of people mentioned if she only got 1 buff off of a dual element forward instead of getting 2, she could have been a 3 cost. Now she can't get recurred by all those different factors.
It's entirely the case that 2 is the magic number in Water and Earth. Between Lena and Ursula and Fenrir and a number of other edge cases as well, reanimation effects seem to be centered around the number 2. Even back in Opus 1, historically they planned for 2 to be a fair number to reanimate because you've got bizarre cards like the 5-cost Wind Devout that can resurrect a 2-cost forward. And I think that a lot would have been solved if Sophie was just subtly different in... If she needed to have more than 10,000 power to do those effects, then all of a sudden you can't just do Doga, Ursula, Sophie. You could do it, and you could maybe have an even bigger board next turn, but you're that turn, and you're not dealing a damage that turn, and that makes you so much slower in the race. So I think that if she'd been, 11,000 power or higher, then you can still play her basically the same way in Monks, because on damage 3 you've got Yang's field effect, and it's just little things like that I hope attention is paid to in the future, and I'm sure these cards have not gone out unplay-tested or even under-play-tested, but people are good at solving problems, and people who want to win are very good at finding the best deck in the format, and secrets don't stay secret for very long in the internet age.
So this was a point I've talked about with Yusufer, James Greaves. I don't know if you know him or not.
Very well, love the guy.
I love him. I wish he still wrote as Midgar blog, because I love reading his stuff. But you can read him on FFTCG Crystarium. And this is a point he talked about, because in Opus 13 we also got a really key card that it's easy to overlook because it's just a backup, but the Sarah backup that searched out the Princess Sarah and just made this color fixing so easy. And he's kind of, we've been talking about this, and like, should they be adding that to all the elements? Because right now, only Wind and Water, Wind's got Norstalin. Hey, I can say, hey, that Althea, don't mind if I just grab it on demand. This Sarah, hey, I'll just grab any of these royals. So, like, do you think all the elements should have that? Because while I don't want to homogenize things, at the same time, it does feel really unfair that, like, Wind Water can just set their backup lineup so easily, and Ice or Fire. Do you like Dominion Legionary? Because here's what you got in Fire. So what do you think about that?
I'm kind of conflicted. I think that there is a degree of variance that card games deserve, but the least fun kind of variance is Mana Screw, and it's why I think FFTCG's resource system is superior to any other card game I've played, and I've played a lot of them over my years. So,
just to be clear, can you define that? What does Mana Screw mean?
Being mana screwed is kind of a Magic abstraction, or in Magic, mana is the resource you are using to pay for all of your cards, and being mana screwed is you did not draw enough to be able to play a convincing game right from turn one. You don't have anything better than draw, pass, discard, or you are quickly to play on curve because you didn't draw enough. And another kind of mana screw is mana flooding, where you draw nothing but lands in Magic. And it's a problem that stopped me taking Magic really competitively after a certain point. I feel like there was only so much I could do, and after a certain point there was too much probability, or too much odd stuff at play. And partly having a smaller deck, but also drawing through it twice as fast in FFTCG, you don't get those kind of problems nearly as much. And then they're much more search happy in FFTCG. In Magic, searches are basically gated behind very high costs.
Oh, really?
Or very particular. Yeah, you're not going to search for something other than... You get some lands that can crack and then find a different land to replace themselves, and they're kind of the backbone of a lot of 3-color decks and stuff. But if you want to search for a particular card out of your deck, to limit the oops, I won on the spot kind of combo decks, there are not many searchers outside of the really old Eternal formats. And if there are searchers, they usually have some other condition attached to them, like you have no other cards in hand. So I can think of a couple of examples. But Final Fantasy has always been much more search happy, on top of being a faster paced game to play. And I think all of these aspects mean that being mana screwed or being backup screwed is just much less common. But it still feels weird to me that not all elements have got equal access to backups that find you backups. And it's the very basis of playing any deck other than an aggro deck is, how can I curve out? How can I start keeping the cards that I draw each turn to play each turn? And how soon can I not have to discard forwards to play backups, and I get to not discard anything to play forwards?
Right.
So Ice really sucks in that regard. Ice has got practically nothing in element that finds you more backups without a degree of risk. You've got the backup lock from Opus 9 that lets you cascade into a particular card type.
Of all the names to put on that card.
But, there's a lot of locks. It's a master of many trades. But it feels risky because you don't want to play lock as a 3-of. If you play it as a 3-of, the odds of lock hitting lock are too high, and then you've just reduced the problem to a smaller selection of the same problem. There's other cards like Quistis that we got in Opus 13, I think. Look through the top 4 cards of your deck and add an ice character or card or something to hand. Again, that can dig for backups, and it's often going to hit, but it's just not the same as Norstalen and Star Sibyl and Sarah as well. Just about every other element has got significantly more consistent ways of establishing you with a game plan, and it's something that I think Ice is rather missing. How deliberate that is, I don't know. Maybe Ice is supposed to not have mana consistency in exchange for having whatever Ice has. I don't know. Is that the price you pay to have 7 CP Sephiroth in colour? That doesn't seem fair anymore.
Yeah.
So it's something that I would change. I don't object to Sarah. I love Sarah as a card. I love the inventiveness. I've seen weird stuff like 3-color monks where Sarah gets you Edgar because Edgar lets you play the Sabin monk and stuff like that. I enjoy the inventiveness of games. I really enjoy seeing 3 and 4-color decks played with a high degree of consistency, particularly when that solution isn't just, I'll draw a Tyro and play a Tyro.
Right.
So I don't resent Sarah's role in the game. I do think that it's a little bit sus that she can find Althea, but, someone's going to find Althea, and I would rather Althea was searchable than wind mirror matches just go to whoever drew their Althea first. That feels like there's no control there.
Oh, I was going to say, I do like Sarah a lot, and in particular, I love that she kind of resurrected Princess Sarah, because beforehand, no one really used that card, because it's a light card, kind of risky, but now that, I can pull it out, you can legit play it in a deck with dark cards, because you'll guarantee you'll pull it out quickly, slam it down, and now it's not light anymore. So I do appreciate when they'll, revive old cards like that, but part of me does also agree with James that, it's kind of unfair that only wind and water get to do that. Yeah, and like you said, ice or lightning, what do? They just sit there twiddling their thumbs hoping,
Do they play 19 backups and then run the risk of mana flooding just so that you can guarantee a consistent opening? I think the days of Lightning feeling like it was a good idea to play 6 CP Sid Previa into Louiswa or something, that feels very 2018 now, compared with what every other deck is doing at the time. And, what Wind can do with just a backup and a Mayune, any opening hand that contains... you look at YRP, and why YRP was the most represented deck at the last World Championships back in Opus X, because any opening hand that contained Brother or Shinra plus Miyuni really contained 4 backups, of which Yuna and Riku were included.
Yes.
You know, and there were so few ways that you could cut that off. No other deck could really compete with that kind of stability.
Yep, that's a great
point.
And
it's always going to be the case that the majority of the tier 1 decks are those that consistently get their CP or didn't care about it in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great point. Consistency is key. I've definitely learned that as I've become a better player. I used to play very inconsistent decks, and you know, they're fun when they go off, but they don't even go off half the time. So yeah, you need that consistency. I kind of touched on something I wanted to mention to you because I'm curious your thoughts of this, is name clash, where I said that backup lock in ice, which I like that. I think that's a cool backup design that in theory you could stick a single skill toad in your deck, guarantee you get it off of that because you can declare monster, declare backup. However, I was thinking, oh, but it's called lock. And obviously that's an issue we've seen with certain tribals, cadets, for example. And just recently, our most recent card of the week was a Nyx card. Nyx, I always want to call him Nyx Wotan. Nyx Ulrich, I think his name is, from Kingsglaive. And now we haven't seen the other Kingsglaive cards yet. I'm sure but I was like, I didn't really like the card. I was like, but Nyx was already like the heart of the Kingsglaive package. So I'm going to get rid of the whole point of that package was that Nyx payoff card for this guy. And I said, they need to put new names in there and that's kind of been the issue with Scions, right? It doesn't matter how many Ishtolas and Thancreds and Urianges you give us. If you keep just replacing the named people, the deck as a whole will never get stronger because you're just using the same names over and over again. So
you're pretty much like a pragmatic kind of player is just going to play the best name that there is available. If they want to play a Scions deck, then what is the best Y'shtola that fits what you're trying to do? Yeah. And usually you'll come to the same kind of answer. It gets a little bit different when you've got something so obviously pushed and powerful and I guess real build around like the new Legend Nyx. I think it's a very interesting card. I do have a slight sinking feeling in my stomach that the ability kind of reminds me of Stern and Mashery a little bit, but hopefully it's more on the Celtius scale of power level.
His seems more controlled though, so...
I love the thought of like pulling out a Regis during my opponent's turn after I've declared a couple of blocks or something. It does seem quite cool as a sort of recovery piece. I'm quite keen to see how it goes. But yeah, I remember I was teaching somebody the game a couple of years ago, this would be, and they asked me in all seriousness, Steve, how many bad cards are you supposed to put in your deck? I'm like, what? Don't put in any bad cards. What does that mean? And they're like, how many bad cards do you put in to discard to play your good cards? And it feels to me like if you're wanting to play a deck that's got a lot of specials, then you're going to be playing some bad cards for the sake of playing good cards. Or if you want to, Illawa Sheol multiple times per game, then you've got your good Illawa, but you've got your bad Illawa. And it's a point that kind of resonated with me that it almost seems like it was designed to be the case in FFTCG that you're supposed to make a cloud deck and try and, omni-slash your opponent into oblivion. And
yeah.
I think that's something that has been maybe neglected in design a little bit. The only deck that I think gets noticeably a bit better from spamming a name is like the new Garland Legend with his special that drains away your opponent's resources and stuff. But I do wonder if we're going to have to play bad Nyx to make good Nyx good.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's just, man, sometimes, and it's so weird, like certain cards will just get the same name over and over again, and there's so many characters in all of Final Fantasy that are never even touched on. Like, I'm playing through Final Fantasy IX right now on my PS4, getting the trophies, and my girlfriend came down and watched it, and I'm in Treno, and we see Dr. Tot, and she was like, is there a Dr. Tot card? And I said, no, I don't think there is. Like, and she was like, why not? I was like, I don't know. Why does Steiner still have some old outdated cards? Like, why does Cloud get all the cards in the world? Because it's FF7. Like, Locke can get 1,000 different names. What about Strago?
I'm kind of weird that it took us so long to get the Turks in FF7, and they felt like a really focal point to me. But I think part of it comes down to marketability. You know, I really love the old Final Fantasies. The only Final Fantasies I've played start to finish have been 1 through 4, and then I think I played 9 all the way through as well. Maybe not Ozma. I don't think I could ever beat Ozma. But yeah, as much as I really appreciate the likes of Gutsko and stuff like that, and Megissa as well, Megissa and Forza and stuff, I am aware that I'm probably in the minority of people, particularly in target or young audiences, who are like, who's this then? I want Cloud. I want edgy anime boy, So there's always going to be that on the cover art. And another discussion that we have quite a lot in the YYT is the starter decks. And I think the starter deck release cycle, or the cadence of those, is really improving. I would be totally okay if we only ever got Final Fantasy VII and 14 starter decks, because the point of them is to be appealing, to be enticing, to be the bait that lures you into the game. And if they are an anchor or point of familiarity by being Cloud and Lightning and, Y'shtola on the box all the time, that's okay. That's a fine price to pay. But there are so many characters that I think, because of the price of familiarity, we just never get to see in FFTCG. I would love to see Headmaster Sid from Final Fantasy VIII.
Yeah.
Thousands wouldn't, but, feels like FF8 would be a different deck if they had a searcher backup who wasn't called Renoa from Opus 2.
If they remembered that there was more than just Squall, Renoa, and Laguna in it. I really appreciate that perspective, because I'm one of the many people who, with the starter decks, would say, oh my God, 7 again, 14 again. But as I talked to RB, she said herself, she was like, I too would like to see, an 8 star. But she's like, but, from a marketability standpoint, we did that, that's why we do it. And so while I may not necessarily internally agree, I really appreciate your perspective on that, hey, if that's what gets the new people in, then just keep doing that. They can find the other cards when they get here.
Being you want to be eye-catching at conventions and at the point of sale in a local game store, and you're going to get that easier through Cloud than you are through Celeste, probably. I'm led to believe that Final Fantasy IV and VI were really popular in Japan. And I appreciate, I suppose, that Japan's own tendency towards the favoured internal titles is being pushed aside for a more global approach, And FF7 and FF14 have got huge global appeal, very lasting legacy and culture around those games. So I think that's a small price to pay. But, Cloud has got that problem worse than any other card now. Of which Cloud do you play? You could probably rule out half of them for being power crept, or, they were only ever a common or rare, so they're not a build around. But there are now a lot of Clouds in print that I'm like, yeah, I know what this card's niche is. I'll totally play this in the right place. But they don't all have specials. So how many do you play?
I feel like I would feel remiss if I didn't even bring this up, but you mentioned specials, so I want to ask you about specials, because that is probably their most underexplored design point. And for the most part, most specials in the game are just kind of like, there's a few that have always stood out. Shoal obviously has always been one of the biggest ones. I don't know how often Paradise was ever used, but obviously it's interesting just because of it's a unique effect. Same with, I wish Giga Graviton was easier to pull off, because it's such a neat idea, but it's just way too expensive. And then, of course, the new Garland, Flare. Like, Garland is a card that, at least in my experience, there are times I'm like, he's not even that good. Like, I'll just dull freeze him, or, you just break him outright. And there's other times I'm like, this card's busted. Like, they just keep breaking my forwards and my backups, and he's drawing cards. Like, and this card is like single-handedly just killing me. So, but again, a great special, but a very cheap special too. So what is it about specials? Because obviously, shouldn't they be stronger? Because inherently it's a disadvantage. Like you said, you're putting more of the same name in your deck. I don't know. Like, how do you see specials?
Specials are, to me, an alternative to summons. Okay. You've got to liken their ability to summons, because if you have a character on field and you've got the ability to use the special, then you can't just play that other character onto the field. It's a cost of opportunity. It's the risk of dead slots. You've got to compare them to something that cannot enter the field. So that's probably going to be summons. And I think an example might be Idea from Opus 2. Idea was really dominant back in Opus 2. Mono Lightning was probably one of the best decks in the format, because we got Alced and Amon and all these cards that sound like a distant relic of the past. But back then, it was a completely self-contained package that just did everything. You had the tempo, you had the control. It was very good. And Idea's special was really divisive because it cost 4 Lightning CP and a copy of Idea.
Yeah.
To someone who can only see the back of your cards, it looks like you just cast a 4 CP Odin, 4 Lightning CP, and losing a card from hand. It basically is an Odin, and I don't think that the opportunity cost of needing an Idea on field and that one card to be an Idea, not an Odin, was really worth the upgrade of it now breaks anything and not just a 4 cost. So I think I was like the first person locally to point out to my friends, like, Idea's not, you don't, if there was another Idea in print, don't play 5 of them because the special costs too much.
Yeah.
And you've only got to look at some of the other ridiculous specials like Orin. Do you remember Orin? Nobody remembers Orin. This atrocious backup from Opus 1, and the special like freezes all your opponent's forwards or something, but it's a backup that you never want to play in the first place, and there's a completely restrictive CP cost attached as well. And there's even some good specials that I feel like... Physalis, there's another example. It's a really good special. It's like Glaciolabolus on steroids. It kills a forward, probably, and forces a discard. Yeah. So I feel like that kind of guaranteed 2-for-1 has got to be playable. But it just feels weird that you have to pay CP on something like that. Like a legend nowadays that has this additional cost as well. I'm not convinced it would be too good if it didn't cost that CP, because there are so many things that I think are better that are in print. So, I like specials as a design space, but I find it very weird the way that they make you want to play your good copy of the card and then not play your bad ones, and that gives you risk sometimes if you've drawn into a hand that doesn't contain anything else playable. So do you just discard the hand size so you're not locked out of playing your good copy of a card, or do you play the bad one? It's a whole sort of rabbit hole of difficulties in building your deck that I don't know I don't know how you fix the problem and make specials feel important without feeling crushingly good. Kind of like the balance just now, but I just like to see it more. I think Lena's Arise special is quite good, but it doesn't feel quite modern day that you can't resurrect during your opponent's turn, or can't resurrect light and dark and stuff. It's just all these little things that they were never going to get the formula perfect from Opus 1 onwards and change nothing. And I do think that there has to be power creep, otherwise things never change, and there's no incentive to ever stop using YRP from Opus 1. But specials are probably the wrong way to make the game good, because the line is too fine between being kind of playable and the only thing worth playing.
That's interesting. I really appreciate that perspective on the idea, because I would have thought of that too, as the player playing it, it's costing me 4 CP plus the card in hand. But from your opponent, if they're looking at it, they think, oh, well, it's the same as casting an Odin. So that I appreciate that. I wouldn't have never even thought of it. And
I think that an increasing alternative to specials is abilities that say discard 1 card name such and such. One of my favourite cards that, in theory, is the Quina from Opus 14 that lets you discard monsters to draw a card and buff Quina for a turn. And I really enjoy abilities that say discard a particular kind of card, or discard a card to do this, because they feel like they're occupying the same niche as specials, but nowhere near as restrictively. Barrett, the Barrett box topper that's not really had its time in the sun yet from Opus 14, I think that's going to get a lot better in the Opus 14.5 meta. Again, name problem, there's going to be a different Barrett for everybody's needs, but it has a very interesting ability that lets you trade cards for something else, and I really enjoy that, and I feel once upon a time that would have been a special, but we're grown up now and we don't need to do that.
I have to give a shout out while I'm mentioning it to the worst special in the game, folks. If you've never read this one, hold on to your snap. I'm going to read this to you. So this is an Opus 8 starter backup. Rude, member of the Turks. He has a special called Grand Spark. So no one ever used this. You would just play him for his backup. Listen to this special. It costs a special, so a copy of Rude, 3 lightning CP, and 4 colorless CP. And you had to dull him. So if you count that, that's basically 3 plus 4, 7, plus the doll is 8. So basically 10 CP. 10 CP. You deal 8,000 damage to all active forwards. That includes your own. And then you can only use it if you control Reno.
The Reno kicker. Yeah, wow. That it's
You gotta have Reno. You gotta spend 10 CP, 2 of which has to be another copy of Rude. It hits all active forwards for 8k, including your own. I was just I'll never forget James Greaves' description of that. He said, good God, that special is about as welcome as a fart in a lift. So I just have to, because
you kind of wonder, is it better than no special at all at that point,
Right. Well, yeah, again, I always use that as a comparison point of so Shoal, I can drop a single Alua, activate the entire board, haste the entire board, subtract their entire board, or I could pay 10 for this highly situational self-damaging.
Pay 10 to shoot your own Rufus, yeah.
Oh, good gravy.
Next level plays, you cast a Leviathan first on your own Megissa, and you use that special to shoot Megissa.
Exactly, yep, yeah.
And then concede because you've decked out by that point.
Exactly. Insanity. Sorry, I just had to bring that one up. That's an interesting point, though, about the discard, because I like that a lot, too, with the Quina or the new Opus 14 Cloud Legend that just says, hey, just discard a 7 card. Does it have to be character? I think it just says category 7 card.
I think it's a 7 card because I'm pretty sure I've seen someone discard like Titan summon for that. The big EX first Macho Man.
Yeah. So maybe they should kind of move towards that, because specials, they just can't say, I don't know, like again, inherently you would think you want them to be cheap because they're already inherently restrictive. You have to have that character on the field. Then you have to have another named copy. But yeah, I don't know. That's interesting because I don't know. I don't know.
Quina has made me think that we're maybe going to get a mashery, but for monsters, and Monster Mash. I feel like I would like that probably more than mashery because it doesn't feel like there's a lot of incentives these days to play loads of monsters.
Yep.
And it felt to me like monsters are kind of, I don't know what niche they occupy because they're meant to be a resource you install on the field and then do something with later on. I don't know. I feel like Typhon most of the time might as well just be a forward. You know, it doesn't feel like a monster. It doesn't feel like it interacts with anything by virtue of its card type other than Nagmalada can search it out and stuff like that. So I would really like to see more payload or more reasons for monsters, but we've got to get some more good monsters first because I still feel like 80% of the somewhat playable monsters are those that came out in Opus 4 and 5 when the card type was new. Things like Flan, things like maybe Leak, I don't know. The Cleone as well, I'll see, once in a blue moon, and those were mechanically unique cards. I can't necessarily speak that they are competitively viable these days, but they at least did something that no other card does. But I look at the Pinocchio Goblin from Opus 14 that 4 turns later you can kill a double 8k. It's just laughable to think that is a card that's being printed nowadays because I could almost forgive it if they were designed for limited play or they were designed for pre-releases and drafts and stuff, but they're not even good there. Like, what are you getting at with these kind of cards? And of course, again, Wind gets the best one. Cactuaroni is, at least it scales faster than other things. 2 activations means more than ping for 4k.
Exactly. Well, and with those monsters, I hope they don't feel like they have to pigeonhole themselves into design that like, okay, so every element has to get a monster. They're all of this for as long as they've been on the field, do X effect, and we'll just cater them to each element. So fire does the ping, ice is the dull ping, lightning is, lose power, whatever, or active ping. And it just, like, I guess I kind of miss like the Opus 8, like Death Gaze. I know he was in Wind, but he did something unique. Scale Toad did something unique. A shout out to my boy Alex, Electric Jellyfish did something unique. It wasn't just, well, no, they're all the same card, just in a different element. Like, so, yeah, whereas a lot of these new monsters, or even the Opus 11 ones where they first came out with the counter, well, what did they all do? Counter, if it's bomb, blow something up. If it's ice, do this. The water one bounces, of course. Like, so, yeah, I'd like to see more creativity, and please not just in Wind. Typhon got plenty.
Green is not a creative color.
Yes. Well, folks, I believe that's all the questions I've had. Steve has been very gracious here to just open his mind and just pour out FFTCG knowledge coming directly from the heart of the Uni Young team. Yeah, exactly. And it's been great. Dude, thank you so much for being on here with me. I'm going to let you wrap up. Is there anyone you want to give a shout out to? Anything you want to plug? I will put the link to his channel in the description below, although it's hard to imagine anyone who watches my videos isn't already subscribed to them, but just in case.
There's no such thing as bad publicity, right? Yeah, the Uni Young team are very appreciative of every one of our subscribers and commenters and everything, and if there's any content that you would like to see, I'm always happy to try and put something down on voice to mic or pen to paper or something. There are so many deck lists, I think I touched on at the start of the video, that I've not put out because I didn't think they were good enough, and if people are okay with that caveat, then I'll just give you open access to everything I've typed up this Opus. Big shout out to the YYT in general. There's far too many of you to name, but I wouldn't have been sane through lockdown, and I certainly wouldn't have been so hyped for lockdown to end if not for the knowing that I've got this great group of friends with this wonderful common interest to go back to locals with, and I really can't wait for proper events to start up again. But until then, the YYT is a very friendly and welcoming place. If anyone out there, anywhere in the world, is ever in the Greater Scotland area, please drop us a message on Facebook or anything, and we would be honoured to have some games with you, even if it's just in a cheeky pub around the corner. So please don't be shy, and say hi anytime you feel like it.
If I ever find my way to Europe, I will definitely take you up on that offer. And yes, big thanks and shout out to the other members of the YYT. I always associate, Steve, you with it the most because you're the voice we usually hear for most of the videos, but they do have a big field of people, especially like when a new the set comes out. You guys get your reviews out so quickly because you've got so many different people working on all of them, and I'm like solo sitting here trying to get through them all. So thank you again so much for joining me today. It's been a great discussion. Folks, if you have any questions for Steve or his comments, feel free to leave them below. And until later, we'll see you next time. Take care.